The silver anniversary watch on my wrist felt suddenly heavy as David's words hung in the air between us. "You need to be out by the weekend. Rebecca's moving in." 30 years of marriage dismissed in a single sentence, delivered with the same casual tone he might use to order coffee. I stood in our kitchen, the one I had designed down to the hand-painted tiles, while my husband of 3 decades informed me that our life together was over, and the woman he'd been seeing for months would now be taking my place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Is this really happening?" I asked, my voice sounding distant and unfamiliar even to my own ears. David checked his watch, the luxury timepiece I'd given him for his 50th birthday, and sighed with impatience. "Sarah, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We've grown apart. It happens." Grown apart. As if our marriage had simply drifted like continents, a natural phenomenon beyond anyone's control. Not the result of his deliberate choices, his gradual erasure of me from his life. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked, genuine confusion mixing with rising anger. He shrugged, already walking away. "Figure it out, Sarah. You always prided yourself on being resourceful. Use those skills." What I didn't know then, standing frozen in our kitchen with my world collapsing around me, was that I would indeed use those skills in ways David never anticipated. That the woman he thought he was discarding like outdated technology would become the architect of his greatest downfall, and that his new wife would be the one to hand me the final piece of the puzzle. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I met David Mitchell during my final year at Reed College in Portland. I was studying computer science when most women were still being steered away from the field, and he was the charismatic teaching assistant who seemed genuinely impressed by my coding skills. We married 2 years later, just as the tech boom was beginning. David had big dreams and an even bigger personality, and I believed in both. "We'll build something extraordinary together," he promised the night he proposed. And for many years, that's exactly what we did. SecureNet systems started in our garage, literally, like all the best tech origin stories. David was the visionary, the salesman, the face everyone recognized. I was the coding genius working behind the scenes, developing the security algorithms that would eventually become the backbone of our success. In those early years, we were true partners. He'd come home buzzing with ideas, and I'd stay up all night turning them into workable systems. When success came, it arrived in waves. First small contracts, then bigger ones. A proper office downtown, employees, industry recognition. By our 10th anniversary, SecureNet had become one of Portland's tech success stories, providing advanced security systems for businesses across the Pacific Northwest. The changes in our marriage were so gradual I barely noticed them happening. David started attending industry events alone. "You hate these things anyway, Sarah." Then taking business trips without me. My role in the company shifted from technical innovator to administrative support. When I developed a revolutionary encryption protocol in our 15th year, David presented it at the Seattle Tech Summit without once mentioning my name. "It's just business, Sarah," he said when I confronted him. "Clients respond better to a single visionary. It's cleaner that way." I retreated into our home, pouring my creative energy into renovating our craftsman-style house in Portland's West Hills, decorating each room with meticulous care. If I couldn't be acknowledged in our business, at least I could create beauty in our private space. David seemed to approve, showing off his home to impressed colleagues and clients. "Sarah has quite the eye," he'd say, as if my talents were merely decorative. Meanwhile, I maintained the secure servers for our company from a home office, working invisibly as David became the celebrated face of SecureNet. I developed 3 more patented security protocols over the years, all of which carried the company name or David's, never mine. Each time, I told myself it didn't matter. We were building our future together. Our 30th anniversary approached, with little fanfare. David was increasingly absent, buried in what he called expansion plans. I planned a small celebration anyway. Reservations at Paley's Place, the restaurant where we'd celebrated our first big contract. The night before, our anniversary dinner, David called to say he'd be working late. I drove downtown on an impulse, thinking I'd surprise him with late-night coffee. The office lights were off. His car wasn't in its reserved space. A quick check of his location on our shared phone plan, a feature he'd apparently forgotten existed, showed him across town at the Nines, the luxury hotel where we occasionally stayed for special occasions. I didn't drive there. I didn't need to confirm what I already suspected. Instead, I returned home and accessed the company's secure server from my home computer. David had never bothered changing any of the administrative passwords I'd set up years ago. Why would he? In his mind, I had become as decorative and functional as the furniture in our home. Present but unnoticed, useful but unappreciated. Financial records, emails, private messages, all of it available to me with a few keystrokes. In the quiet of my home office, illuminated only by the blue glow of my monitor, I discovered the truth of my 30-year marriage. Rebecca Taylor, VP of Marketing at Westcorp Technologies, one of our biggest clients. 42 years old to my 58. Their relationship had been going on for over a year. Hotel receipts, intimate messages, plans for trips together. But far more damaging were the transfers. Systematic movement of company funds into private accounts, falsified contracts, client billing that didn't match our delivered services. David wasn't just betraying me. He was defrauding our clients, embezzling from our company, building a separate financial life that didn't include me. 2 days later, he told me about Rebecca moving in. 3 days after that, he handed me divorce. Papers with terms that left me virtually nothing. The house, the company, our investments, all would remain with him, with a generous monthly allowance for me provided I signed a non-disclosure agreement about the company's operations. "Your name isn't on anything, Sarah," he reminded me when I protested. "Legally, you're entitled to almost nothing. This is the best offer you'll get." He was right about one thing. I had foolishly allowed him to keep everything in his name, trusting that our partnership transcended legal documents. My contributions to the company had been deliberately erased over the years, my role minimized in every official record. On paper, I was merely the supportive wife of a brilliant entrepreneur, not the coding genius who created the technology that made us millions. "I know what you've been doing with the company money," I said quietly. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Careful, Sarah. Those are serious accusations. Remember who people will believe, the respected CEO or his bitter aging wife." That night, after David left for another late meeting, I sat in our home office and made a decision. If 3 decades of loyalty and partnership meant nothing to him, I would no longer be bound by those same principles. I worked until dawn, setting up secure access to the company servers that David couldn't trace or disable. I downloaded financial records, client contracts, email exchanges, and source code for every security protocol I'd developed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I transferred a modest sum, just $50,000 of the millions David had moved, to an anonymous account I created using skills I hadn't exercised in years. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to survive. Then I cleared my browser history, shut down my computer, and began packing a single suitcase with essentials. Before leaving my home office for the last time, I removed a small decorative panel beneath the window seat, a hidden compartment I'd built during renovations years ago, one of many secret spaces in the house that David never knew about. Inside was a weathered metal box containing my grandmother's journals, old family photographs, and a USB drive with backups of my original code from the early days. proof of my role in building SecureNet. By the time David returned home next evening, expecting to find me broken and compliant, I was already 500 miles away, watching the sunset over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I had chosen Santa Fe carefully. David hated the desert, dismissed the city as full of aging hippies and overpriced art. It was the last place he would think to look for me. I rented a small Adobe-style house on the outskirts of town, paying 6 months in advance with cash. To my landlord, I was Sarah Wilson, reverting to my maiden name and sliding back into an identity I had almost forgotten existed. The first week passed in a fog of grief and anger. I alternated between moments of crushing doubt and flashes of cold fury. Had I overreacted? Thrown away any chance at a settlement by running? Or had I finally taken control after decades of gradual erasure? My phone buzzed constantly with messages from David, cycling predictably through concern, irritation, threats, and finally, icy calm. "This changes nothing," his final text read. "The divorce proceeds whether you're here or not. I'm filing a police report about the money you took. Come back now and we can resolve this reasonably." I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the Santa Fe Plaza and bought a prepaid phone. Then I found a small coffee shop with reliable Wi-Fi and began the real work of understanding exactly what David had been doing with our company. SecureNet's client list included government contractors, financial institutions, and healthcare organizations, all requiring the highest levels of data protection. The security protocols I'd developed were being sold and implemented exactly as promised. But beneath the legitimate business, David had created a shadow operation. My 3 days of intensive analysis revealed a pattern. Certain clients were being charged for enhanced security measures that weren't actually being delivered. The money from these fictional services was being routed through a complex series of transfers before landing in offshore accounts. Even more disturbing, I discovered evidence that some of our systems had been designed with deliberate backdoors, access points that would allow someone with the right knowledge to bypass security entirely. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was potentially treasonous. On my 8th day in Santa Fe, I ventured out to a local breakfast spot called Café Pasquale's. The colorful, crowded restaurant felt reassuringly anonymous. I found a small table in the corner and ordered blue corn pignon pancakes, hardly tasting them as I scrolled through news from Portland on my tablet. "Mind if I join you? The wait is 40 minutes otherwise." I looked up to see an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair and bright turquoise jewelry. Something in her direct gaze, assessing but not intrusive, reminded me of my grandmother. "Please," I gestured to the empty chair across from me, secretly relieved for the interruption of my spiraling thoughts. "I'm Eleanor Cortez. Everyone calls me Ellie," she said, settling into the chair. "You're new to Santa Fe." It wasn't a question. "Is it that obvious?" I asked. "You have that look." She smiled. "I had it myself 20 years ago when I arrived. Running or searching?" The directness of her question startled me. "Excuse me?" "People come to Santa Fe for 2 reasons," Ellie explained, buttering a piece of sourdough toast. "They're either running from something or searching for something. Sometimes both." "Running, I suppose," I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. "But maybe searching too. For what comes next?" Ellie nodded as if this was the most natural response in the world. "I came here after my husband died. 30 years of marriage, and suddenly I was a widow with no idea who I was without him." "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "Don't be." Martin was a good man, but I had become his shadow. Coming here forced me to find myself again. She studied me over her coffee cup. "You're not a widow, though." "No," I agreed, "but I am learning who I am without him." Our conversation shifted to safer topics. The best hiking trails around Santa Fe, local artists, the changing light over the mountains. When we finished our meals, Ellie pulled out a business card. "I teach digital security classes at the WEI Community College," she said. "But I used to work for Los Alamos, cybersecurity." I stared at her, wondering if this was some elaborate setup, if David had somehow found me already. "Your tablet has government-grade security measures that you've modified yourself," she continued calmly. "You've been researching financial fraud detection and whistleblower protection laws, and you're clearly running from someone with resources." She held up a hand as I began to protest. "I notice things. Occupational hazard. Whatever you're involved in, you might need an ally." I took her card, still uncertain. "Why would you help a stranger?" Ellie's smile held a hint of mischief. "Let's just say I have a soft spot for women reinventing themselves in their second act. Call me if you need anything. Technical assistance, local connections, or just coffee with someone who won't ask questions you don't want to answer." After she left, I sat for a long time, turning her card over in my fingers. An ally. The concept seemed almost foreign after years of increasing isolation in my marriage. But Ellie was right about one thing. I couldn't do what came next entirely alone. Back at my rented house, I created a new secure email account and composed a message to Ellie, careful to include just enough information to establish credibility without revealing everything. I explained that I had uncovered financial fraud and potential national security concerns involving a tech company, but that my position was complicated by personal relationships. Her response came within hours. "Complicated is my specialty. Let's talk." 2 days later, we met at her home, a beautiful adobe structure filled with books, art, and what I immediately recognized as multiple high-end computer setups disguised as ordinary furniture. "Retirement hobby," she explained, noticing my gaze. "The national labs taught me many things, including how to recognize when someone is selling security systems with deliberate vulnerabilities." I felt a chill. "How did you—" "I didn't," Ellie shrugged. "Not specifically, but it's one of the most lucrative scams in cybersecurity. Sell impenetrable vaults with hidden doors only you know about." She gestured toward her living room. "Show me what you found." Over the next several hours, I laid out everything. The company history, the security protocols I'd developed, the financial irregularities, and the backdoors I'd discovered in systems that were supposed to be impenetrable. "And your husband built these backdoors?" Ellie asked, expression grave. "No," I admitted. "I did, but I didn't know that's what they were at the time. David would request specific modifications to my code. Customization for important clients, he called it. I trusted him." Ellie nodded slowly. "So he had you create the vulnerabilities without understanding their purpose. Clever, and legally advantageous for him." "What do you mean?" "If this ever came to light, he could claim it was your work, your code, that you were the one compromising national security." She tapped her keyboard thoughtfully. "The question now is what you want to do about it." The answer came to me with surprising clarity. I want justice, not just for me, but for everyone who trusted our systems to keep them safe. Ellie smiled. "Then we have work to do." The weeks that followed took on a strange rhythm. During the day, I explored Santa Fe, hiking in the mornings when the desert air was still cool, sketching in local cafes, slowly building the appearance of a middle-aged woman finding herself after some unspecified life change. Sarah Wilson, aspiring artist, recent transplant from the Pacific Northwest. But in the evenings, Ellie and I worked methodically to understand the full scope of David's operation. She introduced me to former colleagues who could help verify my suspicions without raising alarms. Together, we documented every fraudulent transaction, every compromised system, building a case that no one could dismiss. Meanwhile, through careful monitoring of company communications, I watched David's growing frustration at my continued absence. The divorce proceeded as he'd threatened, with the court awarding him everything based on default judgments when I failed to appear. SecureNet announced an expansion into international markets, and Rebecca Taylor officially joined the company as Chief Marketing Officer. "He's getting sloppy," Ellie observed one evening, showing me a series of increasingly risky financial maneuvers David was making. "He thinks he's won. That's when people make mistakes." 3 months into my self-imposed exile, I received an unexpected email to my old account, one I still monitored but never used. The sender was Rebecca Taylor. "I need to talk to you," she wrote. "Not about David, about SecureNet. Please contact me securely if you can." Ellie advised caution. "It could be a trap. David might be using her to find you." But something in the message's urgency felt genuine. After careful consideration, I responded with instructions for a secure communication channel. Rebecca's reply came within hours. "I found something in the financial records. Discrepancies I can't explain. And documents with your name that don't match the official company history." David gets angry when I ask questions. I think something's very wrong. I don't know who else to turn to. "Interesting plot twist," Ellie remarked when I showed her the message. "The new wife discovers the truth." "Should I trust her?" I asked. "Trust but verify," Ellie replied. "Ask her for something only she would have access to. Something that proves she's really looking at the records." Rebecca delivered, sending financial documentation I hadn't been able to access. Internal memos about client concerns, and most damning of all, emails between David and unknown contacts discussing alternate revenue streams from the backdoor access to client systems. "He's not just stealing money," I realized with growing horror. "He's selling access to anyone willing to pay." "Which means we're no longer just talking about fraud," Ellie said grimly. "This is a matter for federal agencies." That night, I made the decision I'd been approaching for months. It was time to contact the authorities. Not local police who might be influenced by David's standing in Portland, but federal investigators with jurisdiction over cybercrimes and national security. Ellie helped me prepare a comprehensive document outlining everything we'd uncovered, with supporting evidence and clear explanations of the technical aspects. We sent it through secure channels to contacts she trusted at the FBI's cybercrime division. The response was swift. Within days, I was speaking via encrypted video call with Special Agent James Mercer. "Your documentation is extremely thorough, Ms. Wilson," he acknowledged, his expression serious. "But your involvement complicates things. As the developer of some of these systems, you could potentially face charges yourself." "I understand," I said, calm despite the fear his words triggered. "I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come with bringing this to light." Agent Mercer studied me thoughtfully. "Why now? After 30 years with the company, what made you come forward?" I considered my answer carefully. The truth is, I didn't know the full extent of what was happening until recently. When I discovered it, I had a choice: protect myself or protect the people relying on our systems. It wasn't really a choice at all. What I didn't say was how David's betrayal had freed me. By discarding me so completely, he had unwittingly released me from any lingering loyalty, any hesitation about exposing his crimes. "We'll need you to testify," Mercer said finally. "Your testimony is crucial to establishing how these systems were compromised." "I'll testify," I agreed, "but I have conditions." "We don't typically negotiate with witnesses, Ms. Wilson." "These aren't negotiations. They're necessities." I leaned forward. "First, Rebecca Taylor needs immunity. Without her cooperation, you'll never get complete access to current company operations. Second, I need assurance that my role in developing the original security protocols will be officially acknowledged. David erased me from the company history. I won't let that stand." Agent Mercer's expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of respect in his eyes. "I'll see what I can do." Over the next few weeks, the investigation accelerated, Rebecca continued providing internal documents while maintaining her role at SecureNet. I worked with FBI technical experts to explain exactly how the security vulnerabilities functioned, and Ellie provided crucial context about potential national security implications. 6 months after I fled Portland, everything was in place. The FBI, along with other federal agencies, was preparing to move against David and his co-conspirators. I would need to return to testify. The night before my flight back to the Pacific Northwest, Ellie and I sat on her patio, watching the sunset paint the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in shades of pink and gold. "Are you ready?" she asked. "For the legal proceedings?" "Yes." I sipped my tea, letting the desert warmth seep into my bones one last time. "For facing David? I'm not sure anyone could be fully ready for that." "He'll try to discredit you," Ellie warned. "Make you seem bitter, vengeful, unstable." "Probably," I agreed. "But I'm not the same woman who left Portland. The Sarah he knew would have crumbled under that kind of attack." Ellie smiled. "And the Sarah sitting here now?" I considered the question, watching as the last light faded from the mountains. "She's done hiding in the shadows of someone else's life." The federal building in Seattle felt cavernous, all steel and glass and echoing footsteps. I sat in a small conference room, wearing a simple navy dress and my grandmother's silver necklace, a talisman of strength from a woman who had faced her own battles. Through the window, I could see Puget Sound stretching toward the horizon, so different from the desert landscape that had sheltered me these past months. "He's here," Agent Mercer announced, entering the room. "Security is bringing him up now. Are you sure you want to be present for this initial questioning? You're not required to be." "I'm sure," I said, smoothing my dress. "I've been invisible in this story for too long." Minutes later, the door opened again. David entered, flanked by agents, his attorney hurrying behind them. He looked thinner than I remembered, his confident posture diminished by circumstances. When he saw me, he stopped abruptly. "Sarah?" Confusion, then calculation flashed across his face. "Thank God. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Tell them this is all some kind of mistake." Agent Mercer gestured to the chair across from me. "Please have a seat, Mr. Mitchell. Your attorney can sit beside you." David remained standing, his gaze fixed on me. "What have you done?" The question hung in the air between us. The same words I had asked myself countless times over 30 years of marriage, as I watched him gradually erase my contributions, minimize my existence, and finally, discard me entirely. "I've stopped hiding," I answered simply. "Now it's your turn." As federal agents began formally presenting the evidence against him, the financial fraud, the compromised security systems, the selling of access to protected networks, I watched the realization dawn in David's eyes. The woman he had told to figure it out had done exactly that. The skills he had dismissed had been turned against him. The wife he thought he had left with nothing had brought everything crashing down. When Rebecca was brought in to provide her testimony, David's composed facade finally shattered. "You were working with her, my wife and my—" He couldn't even finish the sentence, the irony apparently too much to process. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I thought I was joining an innovative tech company led by a brilliant visionary. Instead, I found a fraud built on someone else's genius." She turned to me. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The proceedings continued for hours, then days. Technical experts confirmed my explanations of how the security protocols had been compromised. Financial auditors verified the pattern of fraud. Former employees came forward with their own observations of questionable practices. Through it all, I testified with calm precision about my role in developing the original security systems, how they worked, and how they had been modified to create vulnerabilities. I acknowledged my failure to recognize what was happening sooner, accepting responsibility for my part in the situation while making it clear that I had been deliberately kept in the dark about the true purpose of the changes David requested. On the final day of preliminary hearings, as David was being led away to await trial, he paused beside me. Why? He asked, his voice barely audible. We built that company together. It was our life's work. That's why, I replied. Because it was ours, not just yours. Because 30 years meant something to me, even if it didn't to you. He stared at me. This man I had once loved, now a stranger. I never thought you would. I know, I interrupted gently. That was your mistake. As he was escorted from the room, I remained seated, feeling neither triumph nor vindication, only a quiet certainty that I had finally reclaimed my own story. In the aftermath, SecureNet was restructured under new leadership. The security protocols I had developed were properly credited to me, and a significant settlement was established for clients whose data had been compromised. I returned to Santa Fe briefly to pack my belongings and thank Ellie for her friendship during the darkest period of my life. Where will you go now? She asked as we walked along Canyon Road, admiring the galleries. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. For the first time in decades, my future isn't tied to someone else's vision. That's terrifying, Ellie observed. And exhilarating, I added. I didn't return to Portland. Too many memories lingered there, both good and painful. Instead, I moved to a coastal town in Washington state, where the constant rhythm of the ocean provided a soothing backdrop as I established a small cybersecurity consulting firm. My clients were primarily nonprofits and educational institutions, organizations for whom security breaches could be devastating, but who often lacked resources for robust protection. I kept my maiden name, Sarah Wilson, not out of any lingering desire to hide, but because it represented who I had been before I became an extension of David's identity. The woman who had coded brilliant security protocols in a college dorm room. The woman who had believed in her own capabilities before allowing someone else to define her limits. Sometimes, on early morning walks along the shoreline, I think about the strange journey that brought me here. How losing everything I thought mattered, my marriage, my home, my familiar life, ultimately led me back to myself. How the very skills David had dismissed became the tools that exposed his crimes. How his new wife became my most unexpected ally. David eventually accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy public trial. He serves his sentence in a minimum security facility in California. Rebecca occasionally sends updates about the restructured company, where she now leads a department focused on ethical business practices. And I continue forward, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. A woman who was left with nothing after 30 years, only to rediscover that she had everything she needed within herself all along. The early morning light in Santa Fe has a quality I've never experienced anywhere else. Golden, almost tangible, transforming the adobe buildings into something sacred. I developed a ritual of greeting each dawn from the small patio of my rented house wrapped in a blanket, watching as the sun painted the Sangre de Cristo mountains. These quiet moments helped me gather my thoughts, steeling myself for the long game ahead. I'd been in Santa Fe for 2 weeks when David's lawyer finally contacted me. The voicemail was professionally threatening. Mrs. Mitchell, your disappearance constitutes abandonment under Oregon state law. This will significantly impact your position in divorce proceedings. Additionally, the unauthorized transfer of funds from joint accounts could be considered theft. It would be in your best interest to return immediately. I deleted the message without responding. The $50,000 I'd transferred was a fraction of what I was entitled to after 3 decades of marriage. Decades spent coding the very security systems that had made SecureNet a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Systems that carried David's name, not mine. My new routine took shape gradually. Mornings dedicated to physical recovery, hiking the nearby trails, my body growing stronger as the desert air purified my lungs of the toxic atmosphere I'd been breathing for years. Afternoons spent in local cafes, my laptop open but positioned so no one could see my screen, systematically documenting and organizing the evidence I'd gathered about SecureNet's operations. I wore my new identity like a cloak. Sarah Wilson, recent divorcee starting over in her late 50s. My hair, once carefully colored and styled to David's preferences, grew out to reveal more silver than I'd realized. I let it happen, surprised by how liberating it felt to abandon the pretense of arrested aging. I swapped designer clothes for comfortable jeans and boots, appropriate for the desert climate. When I caught my reflection in storefront windows, I barely recognized myself, and that was precisely the point. The adobe house I'd rented sat on the outskirts of town, where the city began yielding to the desert. My landlord, an older man named Miguel who asked minimal questions and accepted cash, lived on the property in a smaller structure. He maintained the native gardens, but otherwise left me completely alone, which suited my purposes perfectly. Inside, I'd kept furnishings minimal: a futon, a small kitchen table, a comfortable reading chair, and most importantly, a solid desk positioned before the largest window, where the light was best. On this desk sat my new high-performance laptop, purchased with cash from a large electronics store in Albuquerque, where I was just another faceless customer. 3 weeks into my self-imposed exile, I established a secure connection to SecureNet's servers. David had never imagined I would leave, never considered I might become an adversary rather than a doormat. In his arrogance, he'd never changed the backdoor access points I'd built into the system years ago, emergency entries I'd created during those early days when system crashes could mean financial ruin. The password still worked. My hands trembled as I navigated through familiar directories, the architecture of which I knew intimately. I had, after all, designed most of it. I began downloading documents systematically: financial records, client contracts, email exchanges, meeting minutes, anything that might help me understand exactly what David had been doing in the years I'd been gradually sidelined. The process was necessarily slow and cautious. I limited my access to late-night hours, when network traffic was minimal. I disguised my connection through multiple proxy servers. I downloaded files in small batches to avoid triggering security alerts. Patience had become my closest companion. Between these careful digital reconnaissance missions, I explored Santa Fe, allowing the city's unique energy to restore something I hadn't realized I'd lost: a sense of my own distinct existence, separate from David, separate from SecureNet, separate from the carefully maintained facade of our marriage. I discovered the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, spending hours studying how she'd captured the essence of the desert landscape. I wandered through the plaza, observing Native American artists selling jewelry beneath the portal of the Palace of the Pi Governors. I found a small bookstore with creaking wooden floors and a cafe section where nobody seemed to mind if you read for hours after purchasing a single cup of tea. It was in this bookstore, Collected Works, where I first encountered Eleanor Cortez. I was absorbed in a book about desert survival skills, partly practical research, partly metaphorical comfort, when someone sat down at my table without asking permission. "That's a bit advanced for the average tourist," came a raspy voice. "Planning a long-term desert stay?" I looked up, startled and immediately wary. The woman across from me was probably in her 70s, with striking silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a complex braid. Her brown face was deeply lined, but her dark eyes were sharp, assessing me with unconcealed interest. Turquoise and silver jewelry adorned her neck, ears, and wrists. Not the mass-produced pieces sold to tourists, but what appeared to be authentic, high-quality Native American work. "Just curious," I replied, automatically shifting to close my laptop. She extended a weathered hand. "Ellie Cortez, 30-year resident, former Los Alamos scientist, current community college instructor, and dedicated observer of people trying to disappear in Santa Fe." I hesitated before taking her hand. "Sarah Wilson." "Part of that might even be true," she responded with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "This city attracts two types: artists looking to be seen and people looking to vanish. You don't sketch, paint, sculpt, weave, or make turquoise jewelry, so I'm guessing you're in the second category." My pulse quickened. You're very presumptuous. I'm very accurate, she countered, sipping from an oversized mug. Military-grade laptop security, carefully positioned screen, cash payments only. I've been behind you in line here 3 times. Minimal eye contact with others, no smartphone usage in public. Classic disappearing act. She leaned forward slightly. I should know. I helped design programs to find people who don't want to be found. Are you threatening me? I kept my voice level despite the panic rising in my chest. Ellie laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. Threatening? No. Offering perspective, maybe. Santa Fe has been a refuge for people reinventing themselves since long before it was even part of the United States. I'm simply acknowledging a fellow traveler. I'm not... You don't need to explain, she interrupted. Not to me, not to anyone. That's the beauty of this place. But if you're planning to stay a while, you might want some local intelligence. The kind not found in guidebooks or survival manuals. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Instead, I found something unexpected. Recognition, not of who I was specifically, but of what I was experiencing. The knowing look of someone who had also started over. Why would you help me? I asked finally. Let's call it a hobby of mine. Helping women of a certain age who arrive in Santa Fe looking hunted. She slid a business card across the table. I teach cybersecurity at the community college now, but my previous career was more specialized. If you need technical assistance of any kind, I'm available. Before I could respond, she stood. No pressure, but the survival manual you're reading was written by a man who got lost in the Gila wilderness for 3 days before being rescued by a local rancher. There are better resources. She left without another word, leaving me staring at her card. Eleanor Cortez, PhD, digital security consultant, a local phone number, and nothing else. I didn't call her, not immediately. Instead, I intensified my investigation into SecureNet's operations, piecing together a disturbing picture through the documentation I was systematically collecting. What emerged was a company engaged in multiple types of fraud. The security, systems David sold to clients, systems I had designed, were being deliberately compromised. Backdoors were being installed, not for maintenance as David had always claimed, but for unauthorized access. Client data was being harvested and sold. Government contracts were being fulfilled with substandard protections. Most disturbing were the financial irregularities. Clients were being charged for premium security features that weren't actually being implemented. The difference between what was promised and what was delivered was flowing into offshore accounts. This wasn't just unethical business practice, it was criminal. And it had been happening right under my nose for years. How had I missed it? The question haunted me as I pored through document after document. The answer emerged slowly, painfully. I had been systematically isolated from key aspects of the business. My access had been restricted to development work, while implementation and client relations had been handled by teams reporting directly to David. My technical questions had been deflected, my concerns dismissed. Trust me, Sarah, David had said countless times. I need you focused on developing the next generation of protocols, not worrying about implementation details. And I had trusted him. I had retreated into my coding work, telling myself that was where my genius lay, not in business operations or client management. I had allowed myself to be compartmentalized, contained, controlled. 4 weeks into my investigation, I finally called Ellie Cortez. I need to understand how secure backdoors can be exploited, I said when she answered, not bothering with preliminaries. Not theoretically, practically. Interesting opening, she replied, sounding unsurprised to hear from me. This isn't a phone conversation. Café Pasquale's tomorrow, 7 a.m. They have a corner table that can't be approached without being seen. She hung up before I could respond. The following morning, I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, securing the table Ellie had mentioned. She appeared precisely at 7, carrying a weathered leather bag that she placed carefully on the floor beside her chair. "You're investigating something that puts you at risk," she stated after ordering coffee. "Tell me enough so I can help, without compromising either of us." I measured my words carefully. I designed security systems for a technology company. The systems were deliberately compromised without my knowledge. Client data has been exposed. Government contracts have been fulfilled with substandard protections. I'm trying to understand the full scope of the damage. Ellie didn't look surprised. "And you're hiding because knowledge of these vulnerabilities makes you either complicit or a target. Possibly both." "Yes," I admitted. "Does this company have the resources to find you if they want to?" "Yes." "Have they tried?" "My husband has filed a missing persons report and a police report about funds I transferred before leaving. He's using legal channels, at least for now." She raised an eyebrow. "Husband? That complicates things." "He's also the CEO of the company." Ellie let out a low whistle. "You certainly don't do anything halfway, do you?" She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What's your endgame here, Sarah? Exposing the vulnerabilities? Whistleblowing? Personal vindication? Revenge?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on gathering evidence that I hadn't fully articulated, even to myself, what I intended to do with it. "Justice," I said finally. "The systems I designed were meant to protect people's data, their privacy, their safety. They've been weaponized. People who trusted my work have been violated." "That's the professional motivation," Ellie observed. "What about the personal one?" I met her gaze steadily. "My husband of 30 years replaced me, professionally and personally. He's attempted to erase my contributions to the company. He's left me with virtually nothing while benefiting from my work. So yes, there's a personal component." Ellie nodded, seemingly satisfied with my honesty. "I can help you understand how these back doors might be exploited. I can also help you document the vulnerabilities in a way that would be meaningful to the right authorities. But first, we need to make sure you're actually secure here." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device. "This will detect any standard GPS trackers on your belongings. Have you purchased a new phone and laptop since arriving? Or are you using items you brought with you? New laptop, new prepaid phone, paid cash for both." "Good start. But you accessed your old accounts, didn't you? To gather evidence?" I nodded. "Then we need to establish better security protocols for your investigation." She glanced around the restaurant. "Not here. My home office is properly equipped, and I sweep it for surveillance weekly. Old habits die hard." That afternoon, I drove to Ellie's house in the hills east of town. The adobe structure seemed to grow organically from the landscape, surrounded by juniper and piñon trees. Inside, however, was a surprise. A state-of-the-art home office that would have been at home in any tech company. "Los Alamos retirement package was generous," Ellie explained with a wink when she saw my expression. "Plus, I consult occasionally for people who prefer discretion above all else." Over the next several hours, she helped me establish truly secure methods for continuing my investigation: advanced encryption, anonymized access paths, automated alerts for any attempts to track my digital movements. "Your husband will have noticed your access to the company servers by now," she warned. "Even with your backdoor entries, there are always digital footprints." "He'll assume I'm gathering evidence for the divorce," I said. "He won't suspect I'm looking at the compromised system specifically. That was never my official area of responsibility." Ellie gave me a knowing look. "Men like your husband, powerful, accustomed to control, don't respond well to challenges to their narrative. Be prepared for escalation." She was right. The following week, David's approach changed dramatically. First came the public appeal, a press conference where David, looking appropriately concerned, spoke about his missing wife who had been under tremendous strain and had exhibited concerning behavior before disappearing. He mentioned medication I had never taken, therapy I had never undergone, creating a public narrative of mental instability. Next came the freeze on all financial accounts associated with my name, even the small separate account I had maintained, for personal expenses, which I had purposely not touched since leaving. Finally came the private detective, a development I learned about through Ellie's network of contacts in Santa Fe, which apparently included former law enforcement officials who noticed when someone started asking questions about new arrivals. "He's getting serious," Ellie observed when she called to warn me. "The PI's name is Marcus Delaney, former Dallas police detective, now specializes in finding people who don't want to be found. He's been showing your photograph around the plaza area. I need to accelerate my timeline," I decided. "What exactly are you planning?" I hesitated, still cautious despite the trust that had developed between us. "I need to document everything thoroughly enough for a federal investigation. The compromised government contracts alone would interest several agencies." "You're planning to become a whistleblower," Ellie stated. "Is there another option?" She considered this. "You could take the evidence to your husband privately. Negotiate a better divorce settlement in exchange for your silence. And allow the security breaches to continue? Allow client data to remain vulnerable?" I shook my head. I couldn't live with that. "Then we need to make sure your documentation is bulletproof. And we need to ensure your own legal exposure is minimized. As the original designer of these systems, you could be implicated. This was the fear that kept me awake at night. That, in exposing David's crimes, I would incriminate myself. That my technical fingerprints were all over systems that had been used to violate people's privacy and security. Working with Ellie, I developed a comprehensive documentation strategy. We created a secure digital workspace where I organized evidence into clear categories: financial fraud, contract violations, unauthorized data access, and the systematic alteration of my original security protocols. For each security vulnerability, I developed a detailed timeline showing the original design specifications, when and how they had been modified, and who had authorized the changes. In most cases, the alterations had been made after I had been removed from those aspects of the business. But there were troubling exceptions, instances where my coding had been directly manipulated. I spent days reviewing code I had written years earlier, identifying subtle changes that had transformed secure systems into exploitable ones. Some modifications were so elegant in their deception that I might have admired the technical skill involved if I hadn't been sickened by the intent. "This is sophisticated work," Ellie observed as we reviewed a particularly clever alteration to an encryption protocol. "Are you sure your husband had the technical skills to implement these changes?" "David understands the business of security, not the mechanics of it," I admitted. "He must have others helping him." This realization led to a new avenue of investigation, identifying the technical collaborators. Through careful examination of code signatures and internal documentation, I eventually found what I was looking for: a small team of developers hired after I had been sidelined, reporting directly to David, their work kept separate from the main development team. "A shadow operation within his own company," Ellie concluded when I shared my findings. "Your husband is either very confident or very reckless." "He's never faced consequences," I said simply. "Why would he expect to start now?" Each day brought new discoveries, new evidence of how extensively SecureNet systems had been compromised. I documented everything meticulously, building a case that even the most skeptical investigator would find compelling. But I also began to understand the true scope of what I was undertaking. This wasn't just about exposing David's betrayal of me, of the company's clients, of the trust placed in our security systems. It was about potentially bringing down a company that employed hundreds of people, many of whom were completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Having second thoughts? Ellie asked, finding me one evening staring at my computer screen without really seeing it. Thinking about collateral damage, I admitted. Not everyone at SecureNet is involved in this. Most of the employees probably have no idea. That's usually the case, she agreed, settling into a chair across from me. Few conspiracies can survive, with too many participants. Most of your colleagues are likely just doing their jobs, believing in the company's mission. Is there a way to target the exposure? To limit the damage to those actually responsible? Ellie considered this. Possibly, if we're strategic about how the information is revealed and to whom. But corporate wrongdoing cases are rarely surgical. There's almost always collateral damage. This realization weighed heavily on me as I continued my work. I had been one of those unwitting employees, after all, dedicated to the company's stated mission while unaware of its actual practices. How many others like me would have their professional lives upended when the truth came to light? 6 weeks into my time in Santa Fe, I received an unexpected communication that changed everything. An email arrived in one of my secure accounts, an account known only to Ellie and me, created specifically for my investigation. Your husband isn't the only one with questions about SecureNet security protocols. We should talk. The sender identified himself only as KM, claiming to be a security analyst who had identified vulnerabilities in systems provided to his employer. He included technical details that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the compromised systems. It could be a trap, Ellie warned when I showed her the message. David trying to locate you. The technical details are too specific, I argued. And some of these vulnerabilities aren't ones I've discovered yet. After careful consideration, I responded with a request for more information, using a newly created secure channel rather than replying directly. The response came within hours. A comprehensive analysis of security flaws in a system recently provided to a major financial institution, along with evidence of unauthorized access to sensitive data. If this is legitimate, it changes the timeline, I told Ellie. These aren't just potential vulnerabilities. They're being actively exploited right now. Further exchanges with KM revealed his identity. Kevin Martinez, head of cybersecurity for Western Pacific Bank, one of SecureNet's newest and largest clients. He had discovered the security breaches during routine testing, but had been stonewalled when he raised concerns with SecureNet's support team. They've spent 2 weeks giving me technical runarounds, he wrote. Meanwhile, I've documented multiple instances of unauthorized access to our customer database. My superiors are reluctant to acknowledge the severity of the situation. The implementation was expensive and publicly announced. No one wants to admit we might have made a catastrophic mistake. His frustration was evident, as was his determination to address the security failures regardless of corporate politics. I recognized a kindred spirit, someone unwilling to ignore problems simply because acknowledging them would be inconvenient or embarrassing. After establishing Martinez's legitimacy through careful vetting, I shared some of my findings with him, focusing specifically on the vulnerabilities affecting his company's systems. His response was immediate and forceful. This is worse than, I thought. We need to take this to federal authorities. These breaches affect multiple financial institutions. It's a matter of national security at this point. Martinez provided something I had been lacking: current, real-world evidence of how the compromised systems were being exploited. His documentation of unauthorized access to Western Pacific's customer data was precisely the kind of smoking gun that would command immediate attention from regulatory agencies. Working together remotely, we combined our evidence into a comprehensive report detailing the security vulnerabilities, how they had been created, and how they were being exploited. Martinez included logs showing specific instances of data breaches, while I provided the technical background explaining how the vulnerabilities had been intentionally engineered into the systems. We need to move quickly, Martinez urged. Every day these systems remain in place puts more data at risk. The challenge was determining which authority to approach. Local law enforcement wouldn't have the technical expertise or jurisdiction for a case of this complexity. The FBI's cybercrime division was an obvious choice, but navigating federal bureaucracy could take precious time. "I have a contact at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network," Ellie suggested. "They work closely with both the FBI and banking regulators. They could help coordinate the appropriate response." Through Ellie's connection, we arranged a secure video meeting with Special Agent James Mercer of FinCEN, who specialized in cybersecurity threats to financial institutions. Martinez joined remotely, while Ellie and I sat together in her secure home office. I let Martinez present the current evidence of data breaches first, establishing the urgent nature of the situation. Then, I carefully explained my role as the original designer of the security systems and how they had been deliberately compromised without my knowledge. "To be clear," Agent Mercer interrupted, his expression grave, "you're stating that your husband, David Mitchell, CEO of SecureNet, knowingly sold compromised security systems to banks, government agencies, and other clients?" "Yes," I confirmed. "And he's been using those compromised systems to harvest data and sell access to third parties." "These are serious allegations, Ms. Wilson. What's your evidence?" Over the next 2 hours, I walked him through the documentation I had compiled. The original security protocols, the modifications made without proper authorization, the financial records showing payments from entities that weren't official, clients, the internal communications discussing alternative revenue streams. "And your own involvement in this?" Mercer asked. "As the original designer of these systems, you never noticed these vulnerabilities?" "I was systematically removed from oversight of implementation about 5 years ago," I explained. "My role became limited to developing new protocols, while the implementation team reported directly to David. When I raised questions about certain modifications, I was told they were customizations requested by specific clients." Martinez confirmed this timeline, noting that SecureNet's corporate structure had changed significantly in recent years, with a clear separation between development and implementation teams. "We'll need to investigate all parties involved," Mercer stated, "including your role, Ms. Wilson. Whistleblower protections exist, but they aren't absolute, especially if there's evidence of complicity." "I understand," I said, my mouth dry. "I'm prepared to cooperate fully and accept whatever consequences come from that." "Your current situation complicates things," he continued. "You've left your home, accessed company servers without authorization, and are essentially in hiding. That doesn't look like the behavior of someone with nothing to hide." "It looks like the behavior of someone who feared for her safety and financial security," Ellie interjected. "Someone who recognized that going through normal channels would likely result in evidence disappearing before authorities could act." Mercer acknowledged this point with a slight nod. "We'll need you to come in, Ms. Wilson, formally, to provide an official statement and surrender all evidence you've collected." "When?" "As soon as possible. We'll begin preparing warrants, immediately based on Mr. Martinez's evidence of active data breaches. Your testimony and documentation will be crucial to building the broader case." The moment of decision had arrived. I could remain in hiding, continue my investigation from the shadows, preserve my freedom and anonymity, or I could step into the light, face whatever consequences came with that exposure, but ensure that the full truth about SecureNet's operations was revealed. "I'll come in," I said finally. "But I need assurance that all aspects of this will be investigated, not just the data breaches, but the financial fraud, the contract violations, everything." "That's our job, Ms. Wilson," Mercer replied. "Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, it's all connected." After the call ended, Ellie and I sat in silence for several minutes. The machinery of federal investigation was now in motion. There would be no turning back. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Ellie asked finally. "Once you formally provide evidence, you'll be a known whistleblower. Your name will eventually become public. David will do everything possible to discredit you." "I know," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "He's already trying to paint me as unstable, irrational, vindictive. That will intensify. Not just from him. Corporate whistleblowers face backlash from unexpected quarters. Former colleagues who fear for their jobs. Industry connections who prefer stability over accountability. The court of public opinion can be brutal. I thought about the alternative, remaining silent, allowing the systems I had created to continue being weapons against the very people they were meant to protect. Allowing David to continue profiting from betrayal, both professional and personal. "Santa Fe has been a sanctuary," I said, looking out at the mountains visible from Ellie's window. "A place to heal, to find my strength again. But I can't hide forever." "No," Ellie agreed. "Few people can, but you don't have to face what's coming alone." Her words brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I had been alone for so long, physically, present in my marriage and workplace, but increasingly isolated, my voice diminished, my concerns dismissed. Even my flight to Santa Fe had been a solitary act of self-preservation. "Thank you," I managed. "For everything." Ellie smiled, the deep lines around her eyes crinkling. Women of our generation were taught to fade gracefully into the background, to accept diminishment as the natural order of things. I've always preferred those who refuse that particular journey. 2 days later, I boarded a flight to Washington, D.C., where Agent Mercer had arranged for me to provide formal testimony. My evidence, securely backed up in multiple locations, traveled with me on encrypted drives. Ellie had helped me prepare a comprehensive briefing document, anticipating the questions federal investigators would ask and organizing my responses for maximum clarity. As the plane lifted off, I watched the Sangre de Cristo Mountains recede into the distance. My time in Santa Fe had transformed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I had arrived broken, fleeing destruction. I was leaving purposeful, moving toward resolution. Whatever came next, legal proceedings, public scrutiny, professional consequences, I would face it not as David Mitchell's discarded wife, but as Sarah Wilson, standing firmly in her own truth, reclaiming her own creation, and refusing to be erased. The fluorescent lights of the federal building in Washington, D.C. felt harsh after months in the gentle, golden illumination of Santa Fe. I sat in a sterile conference room, my evidence meticulously organized in front of me, waiting for Agent Mercer and his team to return. They had been reviewing my documentation for over 3 hours, occasionally returning with follow-up questions that I answered with practiced precision. I studied my reflection in the darkened window, my hair now a natural silver-streaked brown, my face thinner, more angular than when I'd left Portland. The woman David had dismissed no longer existed, replaced by someone more focused, more determined, and far more dangerous to him. The door opened and Agent Mercer entered with 2 colleagues, a woman in her 40s with a severe bob and piercing eyes, and a younger man whose attention remained fixed on his tablet. "Ms. Wilson, this is Special Agent Travers from the FBI's Cybercrime Division and Analyst Peterson from our Technical Assessment Team," Mercer said, resuming his seat across from me. "They'll be joining us for this portion of the interview." I nodded acknowledgement, noting the shift in Mercer's demeanor, less skeptical than during our initial conversation, more engaged. "Your documentation is extremely thorough," he began. "Mr. Martinez's evidence of active breaches at Western Pacific Bank corroborates your claims about the compromised systems. We're particularly interested in the modifications made to the encryption protocols you originally designed." "Those were the most sophisticated alterations," I explained, pulling up the relevant files on my laptop. "The changes appear minor, barely detectable unless you know exactly what to look for, but they create significant vulnerabilities. For the next hour, I walked the team through the technical aspects of how the security systems had been compromised. Analyst Peterson occasionally interrupted with questions that revealed his own considerable expertise in cybersecurity. "And you're confident these alterations couldn't have been accidental?" Agent Travers asked, speaking for the first time. "Without question," I replied. "They required intimate knowledge of the original code structure and deliberate insertion of vulnerabilities disguised as routine updates. These weren't mistakes. They were carefully engineered backdoors." "Which brings us to motive," Mercer said, closing his notebook. "Financial records show significant payments from undisclosed sources flowing into accounts connected to SecureNets." "Leadership. Our initial analysis suggests these payments correlate with data breaches at client systems." "Someone was paying for access," I concluded. "Exactly. The question is who, and what were they accessing?" Mercer leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Wilson, I'll be direct. Your evidence is compelling, but your personal connection to David Mitchell creates complications. We need to understand your level of involvement in these operations." I had anticipated this question, had prepared for it during sleepless nights in Santa Fe. I designed the original security protocols with no vulnerabilities. I was systematically excluded from implementation oversight approximately 5 years ago. When I occasionally identified concerning changes, I was told they were client-requested customizations. I never authorized or knowingly participated in creating backdoors for unauthorized access. "Yet you maintained access to the company's secure servers even after leaving," Agent Travers pointed out. "Access you used to gather evidence without authorization." "I built those systems," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "I created emergency access protocols during the company's early days when system failures could be catastrophic. Those access points were never removed, never documented in the official architecture. I used them only after discovering evidence of potential criminal activity." "Which you discovered how exactly?" Mercer asked. I took a deep breath. This was the part of my story that made me most vulnerable, where personal betrayal intersected with professional ethics. When my husband informed me our marriage was over and that his girlfriend would be moving into our home, I accessed his private email and financial records. I was initially looking for evidence related to our relationship and his assets, information relevant to divorce proceedings. What I found instead were communications about alternative revenue streams and special client access that raised serious concerns about SecureNet's operations. The 3 investigators exchanged glances before Mercer spoke again. "Ms. Wilson, based on your testimony and the evidence you've provided, we believe there are grounds for a significant federal investigation into SecureNet's practices. However, I need to be clear about your position in this case." Here it was, the moment I'd been dreading. "You're currently in a gray area legally. Accessing company servers without authorization after your departure could be considered a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. However, your role as the original system designer and your clear intent to expose potential criminal activity may qualify you for whistleblower protections." He paused. "We're prepared to recommend limited immunity in exchange for your continued cooperation during the investigation." "Limited immunity?" "Protection from prosecution for the unauthorized access and data gathering, contingent on full disclosure of all evidence and your availability to testify if charges are brought against SecureNets." Leadership. It was more than I'd hoped for, but less than complete exoneration. Still, it would allow me to move forward without the constant fear of prosecution hanging over me. "I'll cooperate fully," I agreed. "There's one more thing," Mercer added. "While this investigation proceeds, we need you to maintain absolute discretion. No contact with anyone at SecureNet, no public statements, no communications that might alert Mitchell or his associates that they're under federal investigation." "What about Kevin Martinez?" I asked. "He's expecting updates on our progress." "We've already spoken with Mr. Martinez. Western Pacific Bank is cooperating with our investigation while implementing emergency security measures to protect their customers' data. Mercer closed his folder decisively. For the next phase, we'll need you to remain available but invisible. Can you do that? I've been invisible for months, I replied with a slight smile. It's become something of a specialty. The following week passed in a blur of detailed debriefings, technical explanations, and strategy sessions with various federal agencies. By day, I worked closely with Agent Mercer's team, explaining the intricacies of SecureNet's systems and how they had been compromised. By night, I stayed in a nondescript hotel in Arlington, Virginia, under a name provided by the FBI, my movements carefully monitored for my own protection. 8 days after my initial testimony, Mercer called an unexpected meeting in a secure conference room at the FBI's Washington field office. The tension among the assembled agents was palpable when I arrived. "There's been a development," he announced once the door was secured. "Someone at SecureNet has been destroying evidence. Systematic deletion of records, modification of code, repositories, alteration of financial documentation. They know they're being investigated." "How?" I asked, alarmed. "I haven't contacted anyone." "We don't believe the leak came from you," Mercer assured me. "More likely, someone at Western Pacific Bank said something despite our warnings about confidentiality. Regardless of how, Mitchell knows he's being scrutinized and he's taking countermeasures." "The backup servers," I said immediately. "There are redundant systems storing all code revisions and financial transactions. They're isolated from the main network, accessible only with specific authorization." "Where are these servers located?" "Physically, in a secure data center in Seattle. The facility houses systems for multiple companies, with SecureNet servers in a private cage accessible only to authorized personnel." "Do you have access?" Agent Travers asked. I hesitated. "Not officially, not anymore. But I know how they're structured, how the security is configured. I might be able to find a way in." Mercer and Travers exchanged significant looks. "Ms. Wilson, we cannot authorize you to illegally access those systems," Mercer said carefully. "That would potentially compromise any evidence we might recover. However," Travers added, "if you were to provide detailed information about these backup systems, their architecture, security protocols, authorization methods, that would be extremely helpful as we prepare warrant applications." I understood the unspoken message. They couldn't ask me to hack into SecureNet's backup servers, but they wouldn't stop me either, as long as I maintained plausible deniability about my actions. "I'll prepare a comprehensive briefing on the backup systems," I replied neutrally, "including all security measures currently in place." "Thank you," Mercer said. "Time is critical here. Every day that passes means more evidence potentially lost." That night in my hotel room, I created a detailed document about SecureNet's backup servers, their location, security measures, and access protocols. I included schematics of the data center layout and specifics about the authentication systems. Everything a federal agent would need to understand the target. Then, after encrypting and sending that document to Mercer, I opened a new secure channel on my laptop, one not provided by the FBI, and began a different kind of work. The backup servers had been my creation, implemented during my early years, at SecureNet when David was still learning the technical aspects of the business. Like many of my systems, I had built-in emergency access protocols, ways to bypass normal security in crisis situations. These backdoors were never documented, never shared with anyone else. They were insurance against catastrophic failures that might otherwise have destroyed the company in its vulnerable early days. Now they would serve a different purpose. For 3 hours, I worked methodically, navigating through layers of security, careful to leave no digital footprints. The backup servers were precisely as I had designed them, their architecture unchanged despite the years that had passed. David had always focused on the visible aspects of the business, the client-facing systems and marketable features. The Unglamorous but critical backup infrastructure had remained largely untouched, and still vulnerable to someone who knew its secrets intimately. By 2 a.m., I had full access to SecureNet's complete backup archives. Every line of code, every financial transaction, every internal communication, preserved despite the ongoing purge of the main systems. I began downloading critical files, focusing on those most likely to prove deliberate criminal intent. Security protocol modifications with timestamps and user credentials. Financial records showing payments from entities not listed as official clients. Internal communications, discussing the special access provided to certain unnamed partners. The evidence was damning, more extensive than even I had realized. David hadn't just compromised client security for financial gain. He had built an entire shadow business selling access to supposedly protected systems. Government databases, financial institutions, healthcare networks, all had been quietly exploited through the backdoors created in SecureNet's security products. As I compiled this evidence into an encrypted archive, a notification appeared on my screen, an automatic alert triggered by someone accessing the backup server's administrative controls. Someone else was in the system, attempting to initiate a complete data purge. I worked frantically to complete my download before the deletion process could begin, capturing the most critical evidence while blocking the purge command through an administrative override. Whoever was attempting to destroy the backup archives, David or one of his technical accomplices, would soon realize their commands were being intercepted. Just as I secured the last critical files, the connection abruptly terminated. My access had been discovered and cut off. But it was too late. I had what I needed. The complete evidence of SecureNet's criminal operations was now safely downloaded to my secured laptop. The following morning, I met Agent Mercer in a small cafe near the FBI field office, away from the formal atmosphere of interrogation rooms and recording equipment. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced than usual. The Seattle field office served warrants on the data center last night, he informed me quietly. They were too late. The backup servers had been completely wiped approximately 1 hour before our agents arrived. I sipped my coffee, carefully maintaining a neutral expression. That's unfortunate. Very, he agreed, studying me intently. Especially since our technical team had been particularly interested in examining those systems based on your detailed briefing. Sometimes timing is everything in criminal investigations, I offered. Indeed. He continued to watch me, his expression unreadable. It's particularly frustrating when potentially critical evidence disappears just ahead of law enforcement's ability to secure it. We sat in silence for a long moment, the unspoken understanding hanging between us. Finally, Mercer sighed slightly. Hypothetically, if someone had managed to secure copies of data from those servers before they were wiped, that information could be valuable to our investigation. Hypothetically, I agreed. Such data would need to be authenticated. Its provenance would be questionable from a legal standpoint. True, but it might provide investigative leads, help us understand where to focus our resources. He leaned forward slightly. Information doesn't always need to be admissible in court. To be useful, Ms. Wilson. I reached into my bag and removed a small external hard drive, placing it on the table between us. A colleague in Santa Fe helped me create some data recovery tools during my time there. Purely theoretical work, of course. But if such tools were applied to SecureNet systems before the purge occurred, the resulting information might be on a drive like this. Mercer picked up the drive without comment, slipping it into his jacket pocket. I'll make sure our technical team reviews this, for training purposes. Of course, I replied. He signaled for the check, then fixed me with a serious gaze. Things are going to accelerate now. Mitchell will realize his attempted cover-up failed. He'll become more desperate, possibly more dangerous. We need to move you to a more secure location until we're ready to make arrests. Is that really necessary? I've been managing my own security for months. This isn't just about your safety, Ms. Wilson. It's about preserving the integrity of our star witness. He handed me a small card with an address written on it. One of our agents will drive you to this location this afternoon. Pack everything you need for an extended stay. The secure location turned out to be a modest house in a quiet suburb of Baltimore, staffed by 2 FBI agents posing as a married couple. My presence was explained to neighbors as a visit from a family member going through a difficult divorce, a cover story close enough to the truth to be easily maintained. For the next 3 weeks, I lived in a strange limbo of enforced isolation and intense activity. Each day, federal agents would arrive to review evidence, clarify technical details, or prepare me for eventual testimony. Each night, I would lie, awake in the unfamiliar bedroom, thinking about everything I had lost and everything yet to come. The technical analysis of the evidence I had hypothetically recovered from SecureNet's backup servers proved to be the breakthrough the investigation needed. With clear documentation of how the security systems had been compromised and who had authorized those changes, the FBI was able to secure additional warrants for SecureNet's offices, David's personal devices, and the company's financial records. We're building a solid case against Mitchell and his key accomplices, Agent Travers informed me during one of our preparation sessions. The evidence shows a clear pattern of intentional security compromises and financial benefit derived from those compromises. What about the clients whose systems were breached? I asked, thinking of the countless individuals whose personal data had been exposed without their knowledge. Will they be notified? That's being handled by a multi-agency task force, she explained. Financial institutions, healthcare providers, government contractors, all are being quietly informed of the vulnerabilities and assisted with implementing emergency security measures. Public disclosures will come later, after arrests have been made. The scope of the damage was staggering, far beyond what I had initially suspected. SecureNet's compromised security systems had been installed in dozens of critical infrastructure facilities, creating vulnerabilities that could have been exploited for purposes even more sinister than financial gain. We've found evidence that some of the access was sold to foreign entities, Mercer revealed during one particularly somber briefing. This isn't just about stealing credit card numbers anymore. It's potentially espionage. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The systems I had designed, the code I had written with such care and pride, had become weapons in ways I could never have imagined. Even knowing I had been kept in the dark about these modifications did little to ease the sick feeling of responsibility. I should have seen it sooner, I said quietly. Should have asked more questions when I was gradually excluded from implementation oversight. Mitchell deliberately compartmentalized the operation, Mercer reminded me. He kept the legitimate side of the business separate from the criminal activities. According to our interviews with current employees, most of them had no idea what was happening either. His words were meant to be reassuring, but the guilt lingered. I had trusted David, as a husband, as a business partner, as the public face of technology I had created. That trust had been weaponized against not just me, but potentially against national security itself. 4 weeks after my arrival in Baltimore, the case took an unexpected turn. I was reviewing technical documentation with analyst Peterson when Mercer burst into the room, his typically composed demeanor visibly shaken. Rebecca Taylor just walked into the Seattle field office, he announced. She's asking to speak with federal investigators about SecureNet's operations, and she's brought documents. Rebecca, the woman who had replaced me in David's life, who had been moving into our home as I was being discarded. The last person I would have expected to become a whistleblower. What kind of documents? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Financial records primarily. Transfers to offshore accounts, payments from unregistered clients, compensation agreements with the technical team that implemented the backdoors. Mercer checked his notes. She claims she discovered discrepancies while reviewing the company's books as part of her new role as chief financial officer. David made her CFO? The irony was almost too perfect. After sidelining me professionally for years, he had placed my replacement in a position to access the very evidence of his crimes. 2 months ago, according to her statement, shortly after she moved in with him personally as well. Mercer watched my reaction carefully. She says she began noticing financial irregularities almost immediately, but didn't understand their significance until recently. Do you believe her? We're verifying her claims. The documents appear genuine, and they're consistent with the evidence we've already gathered from other sources. He hesitated before adding, she's also claiming she had no knowledge of Mitchell's criminal activities when she began her relationship with him. Says she ended that relationship as soon as she understood what was happening. I felt a complex swirl of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also an unexpected twinge of sympathy for Rebecca. Had she, too, been deceived by David's charisma and confidence? Had she discovered, as I eventually did, that the successful businessman she admired was actually a criminal willing to exploit anyone and anything for profit? I'd like to speak with her, I said impulsively. Mercer looked surprised. That's not standard procedure in an ongoing investigation. I understand. But she may be more forthcoming with me than with federal agents. We have a unique connection. I smiled wryly. Not many people can say they've both been romantically involved with the same criminal mastermind. After some consideration and consultations with other agents, Mercer arranged a carefully monitored meeting at a neutral location, a conference room in a Baltimore federal building, far from my safe house and equally distant from where Rebecca was being debriefed. She arrived escorted by Agent Travers, looking nothing like the homewrecker I had imagined during my darkest moments in Santa Fe. Rebecca Taylor was a striking woman in her early 40s, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression tense but determined. She wore a simple navy blue suit, minimal makeup, and a single piece of jewelry. A slim silver watch that I recognized with a jolt as one I had left behind in Portland. Ms. Wilson, she acknowledged, her voice slightly hoarse. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Ms. Taylor, I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. I understand you've been providing valuable information to the investigation. She sat, placing a leather portfolio on the table between us. I've been trying to make sense of what I discovered. The agent said you might be able to help me understand the technical aspects. We were being recorded, of course, both video and audio. Agents were watching from behind the one-way glass. This was as much an official interview as a personal meeting. We both knew the rules of engagement. What exactly did you find? I asked, maintaining professional detachment despite the surreal nature of conversing with the woman who had been unpacking in my bedroom the day my marriage ended. Financial anomalies at first, she explained, opening her portfolio to reveal meticulously organized documentation. Payments from entities that weren't listed in our client database, consulting fees to technical specialists outside normal compensation structures, transfers to offshore accounts immediately following certain client implementations. She pushed a spreadsheet toward me, a detailed tracking of financial flows that clearly connected specific security system installations with subsequent payments from unregistered sources. When I asked David about these discrepancies, he became defensive, then dismissive, said it was complicated contractor relationships and that I shouldn't worry about the technical side of the business. Her expression hardened slightly. I've been a financial analyst for 15 years. Being told not to worry about financial irregularities is like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Despite myself, I felt a glimmer of respect for her professional integrity. So, you investigated further. I did. And that's when I found references to special access and alternative revenue streams in communications between David and certain technical team members. She pulled out another document, printed emails with highlighted passages. I didn't understand the technical terminology, but I recognized enough to know something was seriously wrong. I reviewed the emails, noting names of technical specialists I had suspected were involved in implementing the backdoors. When did you realize the full scope of what was happening? Rebecca hesitated, glancing briefly at the one-way glass before continuing. 3 weeks ago. I found a secure drive in David's home office containing detailed records of payments received for specific data breaches. Customer information from banks, personal medical records, proprietary corporate research, all listed with corresponding payment amounts. And you confronted him? Not immediately. I made copies of everything first. Then I asked him about one specific transaction, the least damning one I could find, presented as a simple accounting question. Her voice grew quieter. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. He became enraged, accused me of spying on him, said I was becoming difficult, just like me, I finished for her. She nodded, meeting my eyes directly, for the first time. That's when I knew I needed to leave, and that I needed to bring this information to authorities. At considerable personal risk, I acknowledged. You must have known you could face legal consequences yourself, given your position in the company. I did, but I couldn't be part of this, not once I understood what was really happening. She straightened slightly in her chair. I want to be clear. I had no knowledge of these activities when I began my relationship with David. I never would have. You don't need to explain your personal choices to me, I interrupted, surprising myself with how little bitterness I felt. That's between you and David. Rebecca studied me for a moment, then reached into her portfolio one last time. There's something else you should see, something I found while searching for financial records. She slid a folder across the table with visible reluctance. Inside was a document I recognized immediately, SecureNet's original incorporation, papers dated nearly 30 years earlier. What I didn't recognize were the signatures. Where my name should have been as co-founder and chief technical officer, there was only David's signature, claiming sole ownership and development of the security protocols I had created. He erased me completely, I whispered. The final betrayal, somehow still capable of wounding me despite everything that had come before. Not completely, Rebecca countered, pointing to another document in the folder, a confidential agreement between David and a patent attorney, dated just months after the company's founding. It outlined a strategy for gradually removing my name from official documentation while ensuring the technical innovations would remain legally controlled by the company. He planned this from the beginning, I realized, a cold clarity washing over me. The systematic erasure of my contributions wasn't opportunistic. It was strategic, a long-term plan to claim my work as his own. Yes, Rebecca confirmed softly. But he couldn't erase everything. When I started looking deeper into the company's history, I found technical documentation from the early years, code annotations, design specifications, development logs, all clearly showing your role as the primary architect of SecureNet's core technologies. She pushed the final document toward me, a comprehensive history of my contributions to SecureNet's development, meticulously compiled with supporting evidence. I prepared this before coming to the authorities. I thought you deserved to have your work recognized, regardless of what happens with the criminal case. The gesture was so unexpected, so at odds with the adversarial relationship I had imagined between us, that for a moment I couldn't respond. This woman who had unknowingly benefited from my professional erasure had gone to considerable effort to document and preserve the truth of my contributions. Thank you, I said finally, genuine gratitude in my voice. This means more than you can know. It was the right thing to do, she replied simply. One of David's many victims deserved justice. Our conversation continued for another hour, delving deeper into the technical and financial aspects of SecureNet's criminal operations. Rebecca's financial expertise complemented my technical knowledge perfectly, filling gaps in the investigation's understanding of how the illicit profits had been channeled and concealed. As our meeting concluded, Agent Travers entered to escort Rebecca back to her debriefing. At the door, Rebecca paused and turned back to me. "I'm sorry," she said, her professional composure finally slipping to reveal genuine regret. "Not just for my unwitting role in all this, but for what was taken from you. Your marriage, your company, your professional legacy. I can't imagine how painful that must have been." "It was," I acknowledged. "But in a strange way, losing everything forced me to reclaim parts of myself I had forgotten existed. The woman who fled Portland 6 months ago is not the woman sitting here today." Rebecca nodded in understanding. Destruction sometimes precedes recreation. Exactly. After she left, Mercer returned, reviewing his notes from our conversation. Ms. Taylor's testimony corroborates our existing evidence and adds significant financial documentation we didn't previously have access to. Between your technical expertise and her financial knowledge, we now have a comprehensive picture of SecureNet's criminal operations. Enough to move forward with arrests? We're preparing warrants now. Mitchell and his key accomplices will be taken into custody within the next 48 to 72 hours. He closed his notebook decisively, which means we need to prepare you for what comes next. The public phase of the investigation, I surmised. Exactly. Once arrests are made, this case will attract significant media attention. SecureNet's clients include major financial institutions, healthcare providers, and government contractors. The revelation of systematic security breaches will cause widespread concern, possibly even panic. And my role will become public, I added. The estranged wife turned whistleblower. Yes, we can provide some protection, limited your exposure, screening interview requests, but your identity will inevitably become known. He regarded me with genuine concern. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I considered the question carefully. For months, I had lived in shadows, my existence carefully concealed, my movements restricted. The prospect of emerging into the harsh light of public attention was daunting, but remaining hidden would mean allowing David's narrative to dominate, letting him portray me as merely a vindictive ex-wife, rather than the rightful creator of the technology he had corrupted. I'm ready, I said with more confidence than I felt. It's time people knew the truth, all of it. Mercer nodded approvingly. We'll arrange media training before any public statements. In the meantime, we're moving you to a new secure location in preparation for the arrests. Pack your things. We leave in an hour. As I gathered my belongings in the Baltimore safe house, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months earlier, I had fled my home in desperation, certain only that I couldn't remain in a marriage. That had become a lie. I had no plan beyond escape, no strategy beyond survival. Now I stood at the center of a major federal investigation, my evidence forming the cornerstone of a case that would expose corporate espionage and data theft on an unprecedented scale. My technical expertise, so long dismissed and marginalized by the man who had promised to be my partner, had become the key to unraveling his criminal empire. And most surprisingly, the woman who had unwittingly benefited from my erasure had become an unlikely ally in restoring my rightful place in the history of the technology I had created. As the FBI agents loaded my luggage into an unmarked SUV, I took one last look at the safe house that had been my temporary refuge. Another, transitional space in a life that had become defined by movement rather than stasis, by reinvention rather than continuity. 3 days from now, David Mitchell would be arrested on federal charges. The company built on my innovations would face a reckoning, and I would step out of the shadows at last, no longer invisible, no longer erased. The woman whom David had told to figure it out had done exactly that, with consequences he could never have anticipated when he so casually discarded 3 decades of partnership. In trying to replace me, he had set in motion the very events that would lead to his downfall. And in the process, I had discovered a truth that no legal proceeding could establish, no corporate record could document. The woman I was becoming was far stronger, far more formidable than the woman I had been allowed to be within the confines of our marriage. That knowledge, more than any vindication the legal system might provide, was the true reclamation of my power. Whatever came next, public scrutiny, legal proceedings, professional rebuilding, I would face it not as David Mitchell's discarded wife, but as Sarah Wilson, standing in her own authority at last. The morning of David's arrest arrived with a surreal calm. I woke before dawn in the new safe house, a modernist apartment in a secure building in Alexandria, Virginia, and spent an hour sitting by the window, watching the Potomac River reflect the gradually lightening sky. There was a strange peace in knowing that by nightfall, everything would be irrevocably changed. Agent Mercer had briefed me thoroughly the previous evening. Federal agents would simultaneously execute search warrants at SecureNet's headquarters in Portland, David's home office, and the company's data centers in Seattle and Phoenix. David himself would be taken into custody at precisely 9:15 a.m. Pacific Time during the company's executive leadership meeting, a calculated decision to demonstrate the seriousness of the charges in front of his senior team. "We don't anticipate any operational resistance," Mercer had assured me. "But Mitchell will likely attempt to control the narrative immediately, portraying himself as the victim of overzealous federal agents or vindictive competitors." "Or a vindictive ex-wife," I had added with a wry smile. "That's why your role in this investigation will remain confidential during the initial phase," he explained. "We want the evidence to speak for itself before your connection becomes public knowledge." Now, as I sipped my tea and watched the sun rise over the river, I contemplated the strange circularity of my journey. 30 years ago, I had been a brilliant young coder with innovative ideas about encryption and data security. David, then a charismatic business student with a gift for strategic vision, had recognized the commercial potential of my work. Together, we had built SecureNet from nothing, working side by side in a cramped apartment with salvaged computers and endless ambition. When had it changed? When had our partnership of equals transformed into his dominance and my gradual erasure? There was no single moment of transition, no clear line between the David who had championed my technical brilliance and the David who had systematically marginalized my contributions. The shift had been so gradual, so subtle, that I had adapted to each incremental change without recognizing the larger pattern. Until suddenly, one day, I found myself completely expendable, professionally and personally. My phone chimed softly, the secure device provided by the FBI for essential communications. A message from Mercer. "Operation underway. All teams in position." It was beginning. I set my tea aside and moved to the secure laptop on the dining table, logging into the encrypted platform established for monitoring the operation in real time. The screen showed multiple video feeds, building exteriors, security checkpoints, agency vehicles in position. There would be no live footage of the actual arrests or searches to prevent any potential legal complications, but I would receive text updates as key milestones were reached. At precisely 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time, 9:15 a.m. in Portland, the first update appeared. "Primary target secured. It's time people knew the truth. All of it." Mercer nodded approvingly. "We'll arrange media training before any public statements. In the meantime, we're moving you to a new secure location in preparation. For the arrests, pack your things. We leave in an hour." As I gathered my belongings in the Baltimore safe house, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months earlier, I had fled my home in desperation, certain only that I couldn't remain in a marriage, that had become a lie. I had no plan beyond escape, no strategy beyond survival. Now I stood at the center of a major federal investigation, my evidence forming the cornerstone of a case that would expose corporate espionage and data theft on an unprecedented scale. My technical expertise, so long dismissed and marginalized by the man who had promised to be my partner, had become the key to unraveling his criminal empire. And most surprisingly, the woman who had unwittingly benefited from my erasure had become an unlikely ally in restoring my rightful place in the history of the technology I had created. As the FBI agents loaded my luggage into an unmarked SUV, I took one last look at the safe house that had been my temporary refuge. Another, transitional space in a life that had become defined by movement rather than stasis, by reinvention rather than continuity. 3 days from now, David Mitchell would be arrested on federal charges. The company built on my innovations would face a reckoning, and I would step out of the shadows at last, no longer invisible, no longer erased. The woman whom David had told to figure it out had done exactly that, with consequences he could never have anticipated when he so casually discarded 3 decades of partnership. In trying to replace me, he had set in motion the very events that would lead to his downfall. And in the process, I had discovered a truth that no legal proceeding could establish, no corporate record could document. The woman I was becoming was far stronger, far more formidable than the woman I had been allowed to be within the confines of our marriage. That knowledge, more than any vindication the legal system might provide, was the true reclamation of my power. Whatever came next, public scrutiny, legal proceedings, professional rebuilding, I would face it not as David Mitchell's discarded wife, but as Sarah Wilson, standing in her own authority at last. The morning of David's arrest arrived with a surreal calm. I woke before dawn in the new safe house, a modernist apartment in a secure building in Alexandria, Virginia, and spent an hour sitting by the window, watching the Potomac River reflect the gradually lightening sky. There was a strange peace in knowing that by nightfall, everything would be irrevocably changed. Agent Mercer had briefed me thoroughly the previous evening. Federal agents would simultaneously execute search warrants at SecureNet's headquarters, in Portland, David's home office, and the company's data centers in Seattle and Phoenix. David himself would be taken into custody at precisely 9:15 a.m. Pacific Time during the company's executive leadership meeting, a calculated decision to demonstrate the seriousness of the charges in front of his senior team. "We don't anticipate any operational resistance," Mercer had assured me. "But Mitchell will likely attempt to control the narrative immediately, portraying himself as the victim of overzealous federal agents or vindictive competitors." "Or a vindictive ex-wife," I had added with a wry smile. "That's why your role in this investigation will remain confidential during the initial phase," he explained. "We want the evidence to speak for itself before your connection becomes public knowledge." Now, as I sipped my tea and watched the sun rise over the river, I contemplated the strange circularity of my journey. 30 years ago, I had been a brilliant young coder with innovative ideas about encryption and data security. David, then a charismatic business student with a gift for strategic vision, had recognized the commercial potential of my work. Together, we had built SecureNet from nothing, working side by side in a cramped apartment with salvaged computers and endless ambition. When had it changed? When had our partnership of equals transformed into his dominance and my gradual erasure? There was no single moment of transition, no clear line between the David who had championed my technical brilliance and the David who had systematically marginalized my contributions. The shift had been so gradual, so subtle, that I had adapted to each incremental change without recognizing the larger pattern. Until suddenly, one day, I found myself completely expendable, professionally and personally. My phone chimed softly, the secure device provided by the FBI for essential communications. A message from Mercer. "Operation underway. all teams in position. It was beginning. I set my tea aside and moved to the secure laptop on the dining table, logging no incident. Secondary locations being accessed. David was in custody. The search of SecureNet's headquarters and other locations was proceeding. The case built on my evidence was now moving into its public phase. Throughout the afternoon, updates continued to arrive. Significant electronic evidence secured at HQ. Financial documentation recovered from primary residence. Technical team accessing server infrastructure at data centers. At 4:30 p.m., Mercer himself called with more substantive information. Mitchell is being processed at the Federal Detention Center in Portland. He's already demanding to speak with his attorneys and the company's board of directors. The initial charges include wire fraud, computer fraud, and conspiracy to commit economic espionage. More charges will likely follow as we process the evidence. How was he responding? I couldn't help asking. Initially shocked, then indignant. Claimed the investigation was based on false information from disgruntled former employees. Plural, interestingly. When informed of the specific evidence against him, he became significantly more subdued. And the company response? The board has called an emergency meeting. We've already received calls from their outside counsel seeking information about the scope of the investigation and whether the charges are limited to Mitchell personally or extend to the corporation itself. Which they do, I noted. Yes, though there may be room for corporate cooperation that mitigates the institutional consequences. That will depend on how quickly the board distances itself from Mitchell's actions. Mercer paused before adding, "There's something else you should know. Rebecca Taylor is being very publicly cooperative with investigators. She's already provided additional documentation about financial transactions that corroborate your evidence." I felt a complex surge of emotions at this news. Rebecca's cooperation validated my own findings, strengthening the case against David. Yet there was still an unavoidable sting in knowing that the woman who had replaced me in David's life was now playing a key role in his downfall alongside me. "Good," I said simply. "The more corroboration, the better." Agreed. The Seattle field office speaks highly of her assistance. He shifted topics smoothly. "We're monitoring media coverage closely. The story has already been picked up by technology, news outlets, and is beginning to break into mainstream reporting. So far, the focus is on the security implications for SecureNet's clients rather than the personal aspects of the case. That won't last long," I predicted. "Someone will eventually connect me to the investigation." "Which is why we need to discuss your public role moving forward," Mercer replied. "The U.S. Attorney's Office would like you to remain completely out of the public eye until the initial arraignment. After that, limited engagement with carefully selected media might be appropriate." To counteract whatever narrative David and his attorneys attempt to establish, I surmised. Exactly. But in a measured, factual way that maintains your credibility as a witness in potential criminal proceedings. After ending the call, I spent the evening monitoring news coverage as it evolved. Technology security blogs were already speculating about the specific vulnerabilities in SecureNet systems. Financial news focused on the company's plummeting stock price and potential liability to clients. Mainstream outlets highlighted the sensational aspects, a prominent CEO arrested by federal agents during a company meeting. By the next morning, the story had expanded significantly. Photos of David being escorted from SecureNet's headquarters in handcuffs appeared on every major news site. The company had issued a carefully worded statement, expressing shock at the URI allegations and pledging full cooperation with federal authorities. SecureNet's largest clients were rushing to implement alternative security measures while publicly minimizing their exposure. And, as I had anticipated, reporters were beginning to dig into the personal aspects of the case. One technology blog had already connected the dots, publishing an article titled, "Where is Sarah Mitchell? SecureNet co-founder and CEO's estranged wife missing during federal investigation." The piece included photos of me from industry events years earlier, alongside a brief professional biography that actually acknowledged my role in developing SecureNet's core technologies. It also referenced David's missing persons report from months earlier and quoted sources close to the company describing our marriage as troubled before my disappearance. Mercer called shortly after the article appeared online. We anticipated this. The question is how to respond. I'm not missing and never was, I said firmly. I left an untenable situation and took steps to protect myself financially and personally. That's not the same as disappearing. Agreed. The narrative needs correction, but the timing is delicate. Mercer sounded like he was walking while talking, background noise suggesting he was in a busy office environment. Mitchell has his first court appearance tomorrow morning for arraignment and bail determination. The prosecution will present the basic outline of the case, including evidence of flight risk. Your situation could be relevant to that assessment. Meaning, if Mitchell's attorneys portray him as a devoted husband whose wife mysteriously vanished, possibly with mental health issues, as he suggested in his missing persons report, it creates a sympathetic narrative that might influence bail considerations. So you need me to be publicly alive and well before tomorrow's hearing, I concluded. Essentially, yes, but in a controlled manner that doesn't compromise the larger case. We settled on a carefully calibrated approach. I would not speak directly to the media yet, but the FBI would issue a brief statement confirming that I was cooperating with the investigation into SecureNet's business practices and was not, in fact, missing. The statement would include a recent photograph to counter David's narrative, but would provide no specific details about my role in the case. The following day, I watched David's arraignment via secure video link from my safe house. He looked diminished somehow, his usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, his confident posture replaced by a stiff formality that suggested suppressed tension. Throughout the proceeding, he surveyed the courtroom as if searching for someone, his gaze repeatedly returning to the gallery where press representatives were taking notes. The charges formally presented were extensive: wire fraud, computer fraud, conspiracy to commit economic espionage, identity theft, money laundering, and tax evasion. The prosecutor outlined the general contours of the government's case: how SecureNet had systematically compromised its own security systems to create backdoor access, sold that access to unauthorized parties, and concealed the resulting income through elaborate financial machinations. David's high-profile attorney argued vigorously for reasonable bail, portraying his client as a respected business leader with deep community ties and no previous criminal record. The prosecution countered with evidence of substantial offshore accounts, multiple properties in foreign countries, and a recently renewed passport, all suggesting significant flight risk. When the judge asked about David's family connections, his attorney mentioned our marriage but carefully avoided any direct reference to my current status, simply noting that Mr. Mitchell's family situation has been complicated by recent events. The judge, however, was better informed. I understand Mr. Mitchell's estranged wife is currently cooperating with federal investigators in this matter. Is that correct? The prosecutor confirmed this without elaboration, causing David to turn sharply toward his attorney with visible alarm. It was the first indication that he understood I might be involved in the case against him. The court ultimately set bail at $15 million with stringent conditions: surrender of passport, electronic monitoring, restricted movement, limited to the Portland metropolitan area, and no contact with current or former SecureNet employees or clients. Even with these restrictions, I was surprised the judge had allowed bail at all given the severity of the charges. Standard for white-collar defendants without violent histories, Mercer explained when he called with an update. Mitchell will be released once the bail is processed, probably later today. His movements will be closely monitored. And the no-contact order includes me? Absolutely. Any attempt to contact you directly or indirectly would result in immediate revocation of bail. We've also assigned additional security to your location as a precaution, though there's no specific threat we're aware of. I glanced out the window at the unmarked vehicle that had been parked across the street since my arrival, a visible reminder that I was being protected, but also, in some sense, contained. My cooperation with the investigation had provided immunity for my unauthorized access to SecureNet systems, but it had also placed me in a carefully controlled environment where every communication, every movement was monitored. What happens now? I asked, suddenly tired of being a passive observer in a process that had consumed my life for months. The case moves into its legal phase: discovery, pre-trial motions, potential plea negotiations. Mercer's tone became less official, more personally sympathetic. These cases typically take months to resolve, sometimes years if they go to trial. Mitchell has resources for a vigorous defense. And my role during this period? Initially, continued cooperation with investigators as they process the evidence. We'll need your technical expertise to translate complex aspects of the case for prosecutors and eventually for a jury if necessary. Beyond that, there's the question of your public statements, which you've been discouraging. Until now, yes, to protect the integrity of the initial investigation. But the U.S. Attorney's Office recognizes that Mitchell's defense will almost certainly attempt to undermine your credibility if this proceeds to trial. Getting your story into the public record accurately, in your own words, may be strategically important. This was the opening I had been waiting for, an opportunity to reclaim my narrative after months of silence and years of gradual erasure. I'm ready whenever you think the timing is appropriate. Let's wait until after Mitchell's legal team files their initial responses to the charges. That will give us a clearer picture of their defense strategy. Mercer paused before adding, "In the meantime, there's another matter to consider. The documentation Rebecca Taylor provided about your role in developing SecureNet's core technologies has significant intellectual property implications. You may want to consult with a patent attorney about reasserting your rights to those innovations." The suggestion startled me. I had been so focused on exposing David's criminal activities that I hadn't fully considered the broader implications of reclaiming my professional legacy. The security protocols I had designed were still fundamentally sound. It was the deliberate modifications that had created vulnerabilities. If SecureNet survived this scandal in some restructured form, those protocols would remain valuable intellectual property. Property that rightfully belonged, at least in part, to me. I'll look into that, I agreed. Any recommendations for attorneys with appropriate expertise? I'll have some names sent over. Look for specialists in technology patent disputes and intellectual property recovery. His voice took on a more cautious tone. I should note that pursuing intellectual property claims would be a separate legal action from the criminal case, though the evidence gathered in our investigation might support your civil claims. After ending the call, I sat for a long time considering this new dimension of my situation. Beyond the criminal case against David, beyond the public vindication of my role in creating SecureNet's technologies, there was potentially significant financial recovery to be pursued. The very systems David had corrupted for criminal gain might ultimately be returned to my control, along with appropriate compensation for their misappropriation. The irony was perfect. The expertise he had dismissed might not only bring about his criminal conviction, but also restore my economic standing after he had attempted to leave me with nothing. 3 days later, David's legal response to the criminal charges was filed, a comprehensive motion to dismiss all counts, challenging the government's evidence as illegally obtained and questioning the credibility of unnamed cooperating witnesses who, his attorneys argued, had personal vendettas against my husband. The filing made no direct mention of me, but the implications were clear. They were laying groundwork to portray any testimony I might provide as motivated by personal animosity, rather than factual knowledge of criminal activity. Mercer called, within hours of the filing becoming public. We anticipated this approach. Mitchell's team is attempting to taint potential witness testimony before specifics are even disclosed in discovery. It's time to consider a carefully structured public statement from you, focusing on the technical facts of the case rather than personal aspects. What format do you recommend? A print interview with a respected technology publication would be ideal. Something that establishes your technical credentials and specific knowledge of the systems in question, making it harder for Mitchell's team to dismiss you as simply a bitter ex-wife. We selected a senior technology reporter from a prominent business publication, someone with sufficient technical background to understand the complexities of the case, but whose audience extended beyond tech specialists to include business leaders and potential jurors. The interview took place in a neutral location, a conference room at the Department of Justice rather than my safe house, with Mercer and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office present throughout. Before we began, the ground rules were carefully established. I would not discuss specific evidence in the pending criminal case, would limit comments about David to professionally relevant facts, and would focus primarily on my role in developing SecureNet's core technologies. Ms. Wilson, the reporter began once recording started, you're breaking your silence after months of speculation about your whereabouts following your separation from SecureNet CEO David Mitchell. Why now? Because accuracy matters, I replied, sticking to our prepared opening. There have been mischaracterizations of my departure from Portland, my role in developing SecureNet's technology, and my current cooperation with federal investigators. I believe the public deserves factual information, especially given the significant security implications of this case for SecureNet's clients. Let's start with your role at SecureNet. The company's official history has portrayed David Mitchell as the primary architect of its security systems, with you in a supporting role. What was your actual contribution? This was the heart of the matter, the professional erasure that had preceded my personal discarding. I spoke clearly and precisely, outlining my development of the core encryption protocols, authentication systems, and security architecture that formed the foundation of all SecureNet products. I was the primary developer of these systems from the company's founding through approximately 5 years ago, when my role was gradually shifted away from implementation oversight to focus solely on new protocol development. I maintained a neutral tone, presenting facts rather than grievances. During that transition, my name was systematically removed from technical documentation and marketing materials, creating a misleading impression about who had actually created these systems. Why would the company misrepresent your contributions so deliberately? I can't speak to motivations, I replied carefully. I can only confirm that my work was increasingly attributed to others, primarily to David Mitchell, who has limited technical expertise but exceptional business and marketing skills. The reporter pressed for more personal details about our relationship and separation, which I consistently redirected toward professional matters. When asked directly about the criminal charges against David, I deferred to the official case documentation, while emphasizing my technical knowledge of the systems in question. These security protocols were my life's work, I explained. When I discovered they had been deliberately compromised, creating vulnerabilities that put client data at risk, I felt a professional and ethical obligation to address that situation, regardless of my personal relationship with SecureNet's CEO. Throughout the interview, I maintained a calm, factual demeanor, avoiding emotional language or accusations that might undermine my credibility. The reporter seemed frustrated by my restraint, clearly hoping for more sensational quotes about betrayal and revenge. You must have felt a profound sense of personal betrayal, she suggested toward the end of our conversation. Your husband of 30 years not only replaced you professionally, but also personally. That had to influence your decision to come forward with evidence against H, rather than the vengeful ex-wife narrative David's team had been attempting to establish. I emerged as a principled technical expert with legitimate ethical concerns about the misuse of my work. The article included sidebar explanations of the technical vulnerabilities involved, making the case accessible to non-specialist readers while establishing the seriousness of the security breaches. It also highlighted the systematic erasure of my contributions to SecureNet's development, a professional injustice that resonated strongly among women in technology, who quickly amplified the story through social media and industry forums. David's legal team responded with a bland statement expressing disappointment at mischaracterizations of Mr. Mitchell's role in developing SecureNet's groundbreaking security systems and reiterating their client's complete innocence of all charges. The statement's careful avoidance of any direct reference to me suggested they recognized that attacking me personally would be counterproductive, given the technical credibility I had established. The following week brought a significant development in the case. 3 senior members of SecureNet's technical team, all identified in my evidence as having implemented the compromising modifications to security systems, approached prosecutors seeking cooperation agreements. Their attorneys indicated they were prepared to testify that David had personally directed the creation of backdoor access points and had been directly involved in selling that access to unauthorized third parties. This changes the dynamics considerably, Mercer explained during his regular update call. Mitchell's defense was likely counting on these individuals remaining loyal or taking the fall themselves. With their cooperation, the case against him becomes substantially stronger. They're sacrificing the foot soldiers to get to the general, I observed. Essentially, yes. The prosecutors always prioritize the leadership in cases like this. The technical team members will still face charges, but with significantly reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. And the impact on the timeline? Acceleration, potentially. With multiple cooperating witnesses from inside the company, Mitchell's team may recognize that fighting through a trial has become much riskier. We might see movement toward plea negotiations. This prediction proved accurate. Within 2 weeks, sources close to the case began hinting to legal reporters that David's attorneys had initiated preliminary discussions about a potential plea agreement. The details remained confidential, but the mere fact of these discussions suggested a significant shift in strategy. During this period, I remained in the Alexandria safe house, my movements still restricted for both security reasons and to maintain my availability to investigators. The initial media frenzy following my interview had subsided somewhat, though I continued to receive numerous requests for additional comments or appearances. On Mercer's advice, I declined all these requests, allowing my single comprehensive interview to stand as my public statement on the case. Meanwhile, I began consulting with a patent attorney recommended by the FBI about potential intellectual property claims related to SecureNet's core technologies. The documentation provided by Rebecca Taylor is extremely helpful, the attorney, Katherine Jensen, explained during our first meeting. It clearly establishes your role as the primary developer of these security protocols, despite the company's later attempts to attribute them to others. What's the process for reasserting my rights to these innovations? I asked. We'll file a comprehensive intellectual property claim against SecureNet as a corporate entity, separate from the criminal case against Mitchell personally. The claim will seek both attribution and compensation for the unauthorized use of your intellectual property. She tapped her pen thoughtfully against her legal pad. The timing is actually quite advantageous. With the company in crisis and seeking to distance itself from Mitchell's actions, they may be receptive to settling these claims quickly to resolve at least one aspect of this situation. Even if that means acknowledging they've been misrepresenting the origin of their core technology for years. Especially then, Jensen replied with a knowing smile. Corporations are remarkably flexible about revising their narratives when the alternative is costly litigation they're likely to lose. They'll frame it as recognizing your previously under-acknowledged contributions rather than admitting deliberate erasure. I found myself smiling at her cynical but accurate assessment. And financially, what can I reasonably expect? Based. It's actually conservative, Jensen countered. We're talking about foundational encryption and authentication protocols that have been implemented across multiple industries for nearly 3 decades. The licensing value alone is substantial, even setting aside the damages for misappropriation. As we discussed strategy for these claims, I found myself experiencing an unexpected emotion, not vindication or satisfaction, but a kind of wistful regret for what might have been. If David had maintained our original partnership, acknowledging my contributions while leveraging his own business acumen, SecureNet could have remained an innovative, ethical company at the forefront of cybersecurity. Our combined talents had been powerful. Our division had ultimately destroyed everything we had built. That evening, alone in the safe house, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey of the past 7 months. From the devastated woman told to figure it out, as she was discarded after 30 years of marriage, to the determined investigator in Santa Fe, to the credible technical witness whose testimony would help ensure David faced consequences for his actions. Each phase had revealed different aspects of my own strength, a strength I had forgotten during years of gradual diminishment within my marriage. The ringing of my secure phone interrupted these reflections. It was Mercer, his voice tense with suppressed excitement. Mitchell's team has approached the prosecutors with a formal plea offer. He's willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentencing recommendation at the lower end of the guidelines. Which would mean what, exactly? Approximately 8 to 10 years in federal prison, substantial financial penalties, and permanent exclusion from any role in publicly traded companies. Most significantly, he would be required to make a full public statement acknowledging his actions and accepting responsibility. Including the deliberate compromise of security systems I designed? Yes. The prosecutors were very clear on that point. No ambiguity about the nature of the criminal activity or who was responsible for the original technology that was compromised. I sat with this information, allowing the implications to settle. David would serve significant prison time. His reputation in the business world would be permanently destroyed. And perhaps most meaningful to me personally, he would be forced to publicly acknowledge both his crimes and my rightful role as the creator of the technology he had corrupted. What happens next? I asked finally. The prosecutors will make a counteroffer, probably pushing for a slightly longer sentence. There will be negotiations over specific terms, but the fundamental framework seems likely to proceed. Mercer paused before adding, "This would eliminate the need for a public trial, including your direct testimony against Mitchell. Is that outcome acceptable to you?" I considered the question carefully. Part of me had anticipated the catharsis of facing David in court, of publicly detailing how he had betrayed not just me but the very technology we had created together. Yet the prospect of that confrontation also carried emotional costs I wasn't certain I wanted to pay. Yes, I decided. If he fully admits his actions and acknowledges my role in creating the original security systems, that's sufficient. Justice doesn't require my personal participation in his public humiliation. I'll convey that to the prosecution team, Mercer replied, sounding relieved. They'll appreciate your reasonableness on this point. It strengthens their negotiating position considerably. After ending the call, I moved to the apartment's balcony, looking out over the Potomac as evening settled over Alexandria. The river flowed steadily onward, indifferent to the human dramas played out along its banks. In that moment, I envied its serene continuity, its unhesitating forward movement. For months, my existence had been defined by looking backward, documenting past betrayals, gathering evidence of previous crimes, seeking justice for what had already occurred. Now, with David's case moving toward resolution, I found myself contemplating a different question. What came next? Who would I become when I was no longer defined by my marriage, my erasure, or my quest for accountability? The woman who had fled Portland in desperation 7 months earlier no longer existed. The technical expert who had meticulously documented SecureNet's compromised systems had served her purpose. Even the poised professional who had given that carefully calibrated media interview was a transitional identity, necessary for a specific moment in this evolving situation. Who was Sarah Wilson beyond all these reactive personas? What did I actually want once justice had been served and my professional legacy restored? These questions had no immediate answers, but for the first time since David had casually informed me our marriage was over, I felt genuine curiosity about my own future rather than determination to address past wrongs. It was a subtle shift in orientation, from looking back in anger to looking forward with possibility. As darkness fell over the river, I made a decision. Once the plea agreement was finalized, once my obligations to the federal investigation were complete, I would not return to Portland with its painful associations. Nor would I remain in Santa Fe, which had been a necessary refuge, but never a true home. Instead, I would find a new place to establish myself, somewhere I had chosen, freely rather than fled to out of necessity. With the financial resources from my intellectual property claims and the professional credibility restored by the resolution of the criminal case, I would have options that had seemed unimaginable when David dismissed me from his life. I could establish a consulting practice focused on ethical security implementations. I could teach at the university level, sharing my technical expertise with a new generation. I could even develop new security protocols under my own name, no longer hidden behind a corporate identity controlled by others. The possibilities stretched before me like the river itself, flowing forward into territories yet unexplored, carrying me toward a future I would shape according to my own vision, rather than someone else's limitations. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt a stirring of genuine excitement about what might lie ahead. The woman David had told to figure it out when he discarded her after 30 years had indeed figured it out. Not just how to survive his betrayal, not just how to expose his crimes, but ultimately how to reclaim her own power and define her own path forward. That, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, was the true triumph emerging from the ruins of everything I had lost. The realization brought a smile to my face as I watched the lights of Alexandria reflect on the dark surface of the Potomac, shimmering with possibilities as endless as the river itself. I stand at the back of the courtroom, deliberately unnoticed as David enters in his prison-issued uniform. The confident CEO is gone, replaced by a man whose shoulders slump slightly under the weight of his crimes. Today, he will formally accept the plea agreement, 8 years in federal prison, millions in fines, and a public admission of exactly what he did. Our eyes meet briefly as he scans the gallery. Recognition flashes across his face, followed by something I never expected to see. Shame. He quickly looks away, conferring with his attorney while studiously avoiding my gaze. The proceedings are brief, clinical. David speaks only to confirm his understanding of the agreement and his willingness to accept it. When asked if he wishes to make a statement, he declines. His attorney explains they've prepared a written statement for release after the hearing. I slip out before the proceedings end, not wanting our final interaction to be defined by his awareness of my presence. Outside, spring sunshine warms my face as I walk toward the harbor. My new home in Seattle feels right, close enough to monitor the aftermath of SecureNet's restructuring, but far from Portland's painful memories. The intellectual property settlement exceeded even my attorney's expectations. SecureNet's board, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of David's crimes, agreed to formally acknowledge my role as the primary developer of their core security protocols. The financial compensation ensures I'll never worry about money again. More meaningful is the professional restoration. 3 universities have approached me about guest lecturing positions. A prominent tech incubator wants me to mentor women developing security applications. My phone contains messages from former colleagues expressing belated recognition of my contributions. I reach the waterfront and pause, watching ferries cross, the sound against the backdrop of distant mountains. Rebecca's last email sits unanswered in my inbox, a tentative suggestion that we might someday meet for coffee, compare notes on the experience of loving and being betrayed by the same man. Perhaps someday I'll accept. For now, I'm content with this moment of completion. The man who told me to figure it out when he discarded me never imagined I would figure out not just his crimes, but my own path forward. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me ultimately revealed a strength I had forgotten I possessed. I turn away from the water and walk toward my future, no longer defined by what I've lost, but by what I've reclaimed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.